Everyone says the Big Boy was the most powerful steam locomotive ever built, the final boss of steam, the machine that ended the argument forever. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the run that truly shook American railroading wasn't just about speed or size, but about a moment so extreme it cracked the steel rails beneath it? And what if the locomotive history crowned as king wasn't the one that actually broke the limits of the track itself? History remembers the Big Boy exactly how legends are supposed to be remembered. Massive, confident, untouchable. Built during the height of American industrial ambition, the Union Pacific Big Boy became a rolling monument to power. 8 driving wheels in front, 8 more behind. A boiler so large it looked like a moving factory. At over 1.2 million pounds with tender, it wasn't just heavy, it was overwhelming. Designed to haul freight across the brutal grades of Wyoming's Wasatch Range without helpers, it did what no single locomotive had done before. It pulled trains longer than football fields. It ran faster than anyone expected something that large ever could. On paper, it produced over 6,000 horsepower. In practice, it made mountains feel smaller. Rail fans still talk about it with reverence. The Big Boy didn't just move trains, it moved belief. Belief that steam had reached its final, perfect form, that nothing larger, stronger, or more capable would ever be needed. And when diesel locomotives eventually replaced steam, the Big Boy stood frozen in memory as the ultimate expression of a dying era. The largest, the most famous, the one that survived in museums, postcards, and public imagination. But the records tell a different story. Buried in test reports, maintenance logs, and engineering memos is a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. The Big Boy was powerful, but it was also carefully restrained. Union Pacific engineers knew exactly how close they were skating to the edge. Axle loads were limited, speeds were controlled, routes were chosen deliberately. The Big Boy was designed not just to pull hard, but to survive the railroad it ran on. Its greatness came from balance, immense force carefully distributed. What history rarely mentions is that elsewhere other railroads were asking a more dangerous question. Not how powerful can we make it without breaking the rails, but how much power can the rails survive? In the early 1940s, while the Big Boy was earning its reputation in the West, engineers in the East were facing a different problem. Shorter routes, steeper grades, heavier coal trains, and tracks that had already been pushed to their limits. The answer they built was not famous. It wasn't preserved. It wasn't paraded at anniversary events, but it was terrifyingly strong. The Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny. The Allegheny was built for one purpose: brute force. It was not elegant. It was not gentle. It was designed to move coal, endless, suffocating tonnage, through the Appalachian Mountains with as few locomotives as possible. Where the Big Boy balanced power and speed, the Allegheny leaned fully into raw tractive effort, over 110,000 pounds of it. Some tests recorded even more. Its boiler pressure was higher, its cylinders were enormous, and its weight, especially its axle load, was something railroads had never fully dealt with before. This is where the story turns. During early test runs, C&O engineers noticed something alarming. After the Allegheny passed, track inspectors found cracked railheads. Not derailments, not accidents, stress fractures, steel rails that had been intact for years, suddenly compromised after a single run. The locomotive hadn't failed. The track had. This wasn't folklore, it was documented. The Allegheny was so heavy, so forceful at low speeds, that it exceeded what much of the existing rail infrastructure had been designed to handle. In some areas, speed restrictions weren't imposed to protect the locomotive, but to protect the rails from it. Reinforced track was required. Maintenance costs climbed, but the coal kept moving, and that was all that mattered. On test stands, the Allegheny reportedly developed over 7,500 horsepower. Higher than the Big Boy, higher than anything steam had reliably produced in service. But unlike the Big Boy, it did not become a symbol of national pride. It became a liability, an accounting problem, a machine that did its job too well, and it wasn't alone. Around the same time, the Pennsylvania Railroad unveiled something even more audacious. The PRR-S1 was a machine that looked like it came from the future. Streamlined, massive, experimental. Designed for speed rather than drag freight, it reportedly exceeded 100 miles per hour during tests, but it was so long it couldn't fit comfortably into standard yards. So powerful it strained turntables. So specialized it had nowhere to go once the test phase ended. It wasn't scrapped because it failed. It was scrapped because the railroad couldn't justify adapting the entire system around it. Then there was the Norfolk and Western Y6B, smaller than the big boy, less famous, but pound for pound, one of the most efficient pulling machines ever built. On steep grades, at low speeds, the Y6B could embarrass larger locomotives. It didn't crack rails, but it made engineers question everything they thought they knew about size versus effectiveness. So why does history only remember one? Because history doesn't belong to the strongest machine. It belongs to the best story. The big boy survived because it fit the narrative. It was powerful, but not destructive. Impressive, but manageable. It ran on a railroad wealthy enough to preserve it. A railroad smart enough to market it. A railroad that understood image mattered as much as performance. When dieselization came, Union Pacific saved big boys. Put them on display. Let them become icons. The Allegheny didn't get that luxury. It was expensive to maintain. Hard on infrastructure. Built just as diesel power was proving cheaper, cleaner, and easier to standardize. The railroad didn't want a monument. It wanted efficiency. And so the most powerful steam locomotive ever to threaten the rails beneath it quietly disappeared. Scrapped. Forgotten. Reduced to footnotes and specialist books. This is how legacy works. Success alone is never enough. Timing matters. Geography matters. Public memory is shaped by what survives, not by what pushed the hardest. The big boy became a legend because it was the strongest machine that didn't demand the world change for it. The Allegheny demanded stronger rails, deeper budgets, and more tolerance for risk. And history said no. When people stand beside a preserved big boy today, they feel awe. They feel connection. They feel certainty. They believe they are looking at the peak. But somewhere in the numbers, in the cracked steel that had to be replaced, in the test runs that were never meant for public celebration, there's another truth. One that suggests the real limit of steam wasn't the locomotive. It was the world beneath it. To understand just how close these machines came to the edge, you have to step into the mindset of the engineers who built them. These were not dreamers chasing legends. They were problem solvers under pressure. Coal demand was exploding. War was coming. Factories needed fuel. Delays were unacceptable. Every stalled train meant lost money, lost time, and in some cases lost lives. Railroads were no longer experimenting for curiosity. They were gambling with steel, steam, and reputation. The question wasn't whether a locomotive could be built stronger. That had already been answered. The question was whether the rest of the railroad could survive it. Track seems solid when you look at it. Heavy rails, wooden ties, ballast packed tight. But railroads are elastic systems. Every axle load bends the steel just slightly. Every passing train creates invisible waves of stress that travel down the line. For decades, engineers had calculated safe limits based on known forces. The problem with the most extreme steam locomotives was that they didn't just approach those limits, they lived there. On paper, the numbers were breathtaking. Tractive effort figures that dwarfed previous designs, cylinder dimensions that looked almost absurd, boiler pressures that demanded absolute perfection in metallurgy. These locomotives could start trains that others couldn't even budge. They could take grades at speeds that rewrote timetables, and when they did, everything beneath them paid the price. Rail inspectors began noticing patterns. Tiny fractures at joint bars, deformation at railheads, fasteners loosening sooner than expected. Nothing dramatic at first, no catastrophic failures, just signs that the margin of safety was shrinking. Maintenance crews worked harder. Replacement cycles shortened. Costs quietly climbed. The railroads understood exactly what was happening. They just didn't talk about it publicly. Because admitting that your most powerful machines were stressing your infrastructure was dangerous. It raised questions about liability, about long-term sustainability, about whether steam itself had become too powerful for the system it was built to serve. This is where diesel-electric locomotives enter the story, not as villains, but as pragmatists. Diesels didn't hit the track with the same hammer blow. Their power delivery was smoother. Their axle loads were more predictable. They could be run in multiple units, spreading force across more wheels instead of concentrating it into one monstrous frame. Railroads didn't fall in love with diesels because they were beautiful. They adopted them because they were kind to the rails. And that made the most extreme steam locomotives look like relics from a different philosophy. A philosophy that believed the answer to every problem was more mass, more pressure, more force. Some engineers resisted this shift. They argued that steam had not reached its true potential, that better alloys, better track, better maintenance could support even greater machines. In isolated tests, they were probably right. Given unlimited budgets and redesigned infrastructure, steam could have gone further. But railroads do not operate in laboratories. They operate in markets. Every dollar spent reinforcing track for a single class of locomotive was a dollar not spent elsewhere. Every specialized machine increased complexity, and complexity is the enemy of profit. So the railroads made a choice, not based on romance, based on spreadsheets. The most powerful steam locomotives ever built were quietly sidelined, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too violently. They exposed the hidden weaknesses of the system. They proved that raw power alone was no longer the future. That's why so many of these machines vanished almost without ceremony. No farewell tours, no preservation campaigns. They were cut apart while still relatively young, their metal recycled into a world that no longer needed them. Meanwhile, the legends that survived were the ones that fit neatly into memory, the ones that could be admired without uncomfortable questions, the ones that impressed without threatening collapse. And this selective memory shaped how generations understood steam power. Ask most people about the peak of steam, and they'll point to size, to length, to spectacle. They'll talk about how many wheels, how tall the boiler stood, how fast it could run. They rarely talk about axle loading, about stress distribution, about the quiet moments after a test run when inspectors walked the track, marking places where steel had begun to give way. But those moments mattered more than any photograph, because they marked the line between engineering triumph and systemic risk. In many ways, the final years of steam were not a story of decline, but of overachievement. Steam locomotives became so good at what they did that they outgrew the environment they were meant to operate in. They were like athletes whose strength exceeded the limits of the arena itself. And when that happens, the rules change. What makes this story uncomfortable is that it forces us to rethink how we define the greatest. Is greatness about maximum output or about harmony with the system around you? Is the most powerful machine the one that produces the biggest numbers, or the one that can do its job for decades without demanding everything else bent around it? The answers aren't simple, and history rarely likes simple machines with complicated legacies. So instead, it streamlined the narrative. It elevated icons. It trimmed away the uncomfortable extremes. It told a story where progress marched cleanly forward, where the biggest and best naturally earned their place in memory. But beneath that story lies another one, a story written in stress fractures and maintenance logs, a story of locomotives that briefly became too powerful for the world they ran on. And once you see that story, it changes how you look at everything that came after. It makes dieselization feel less like betrayal and more like adaptation, less like the death of steam and more like an acknowledgement that brute force had reached diminishing returns. It also reminds us that technological history is not a straight line upward. It's a series of negotiations between what can be built and what can be sustained. Those negotiations don't always reward the strongest contender. They reward the one that fits. So the next time someone says the big boy was the most powerful steam locomotive ever built, ask a quieter question. Ask which machine forced the rails themselves to surrender. Ask which one crossed the line where power stopped being impressive and started becoming dangerous. And ask yourself why that's not the story we tell. Because history doesn't remember what shook the ground the hardest. It remembers what we chose to save.